Hello, everyone. It's been a while since I've made a video, and I thought I have been lax in answering questions that people have asked on my Tumblr or in my YouTube comments. So I wanted to answer this question from chillorangescube. Hey, Josh, maybe this is a bit of a difficult question, but as someone who has worked in the video game industry for a good while, what would you say are the most important skills I need to have to become a game developer? Specifically for a text-heavy game. My expertise is in writing, and I really like the idea of working on video game RPGs as a writer, but I feel like that may not be enough. What else should I understand how to do if I intend to work on video games? I'll be honest, I have no experience at all in video game development. Are there good starting jobs or certificates I should consider getting? A couple things I'll start with. So, for narrative designers specifically, just FYI, the layoffs that have been happening over the last 3 years, I guess we're into our fourth year now, we'll see where this goes, have disproportionately affected narrative designers. It is unfortunately a very difficult time to hold on to, much less get a job as a narrative designer in the game industry. I don't want to be too discouraging, but that is what the numbers have shown. GDC releases a state of the industry survey every year. It's not good. A lot of layoffs. Anyway, not to be too depressing about that, but that's the reality of it. The other thing I will say is that certifications, I do think there are good programs, CGMA, Gnomon. There are, of course, schools. I don't necessarily know how applicable those are to narrative design. They are more applicable to things like animation or level design or environment art and things like that. But there are also private programs out there for game writing. You can find them if you do a search. I don't have personal experience with them. So, what do I actually know? Well, I'll try to fill you in on a little bit of it. So, I will say that for developers overall, there's a few things that I've said before I think are very important. One is critical thinking. I think this is important for all game developers. Critical thinking, and in a very basic form, is the ability to sort of rationally look at and break down and critique things, sort of understand how something works, how it goes together, what you're trying to do. It's an approach to problem solving and analysis that I think is used in game development constantly. You're always trying to solve problems. You're also always trying to understand how things work, how they're made, and looking at other games and asking yourself, how did they do this? Is this the thing that we want to do? Should we do it the same way? Should we do it differently? Critical thinking helps you with all of these things in all disciplines. Goal-oriented collaboration. This is something that I think people learn intuitively the longer they're in the industry. I think it's maybe more difficult for people when they're in their early stages of their career. And the idea behind goal-oriented collaboration is that you talk about what you're trying to do at the highest level first. So, what are you trying to do from an experiential perspective? Like, we want the player to feel this thing or experience this thing. We want to make them make this type of choice and think about things in this way. Or we want them to feel scared or overwhelmed or challenged or frustrated. And these are very high level goals. And they're very important to talk about because, one, if you don't agree on what those goals are, everything else that you're talking about underneath that doesn't really matter. Because if you're trying to create a fundamentally different experience for the player or for a different type of audience, that's extremely important to discuss and like resolve. It's not to say that every moment in a game is going to appeal to the ideal player, but the people making the game need to be on the same page about what you're trying to do at a really basic level. And once you agree on that, the way in which you accomplish that can change a lot. And really, the way in which you accomplish it can be solved by the individual expertise that the people participating bring to it. The narrative designer has a certain approach. The animator has a certain approach. The storyboard artist has a certain approach. The engineer has a certain approach. And if you're all talking about trying to create the same thing, you can all inform each other about the best way to do that and collaborate in a really healthy way. I think that when people get hung up on talking about their individual preferences, you don't get anywhere. Who cares? Like, it matters a little bit. Like, people don't like to make things they fundamentally don't like, but you're not making the game literally just for yourself. I mean, maybe you are, but if you're making it for an audience, then you should talk about the audience and what you kind of want them to go through. So, goal oriented collaboration, I think, is very important. Stating those goals, discussing those goals, and then working down from those goals, and then returning back to the goals. Once you've executed and you're looking at the thing you've made, saying, does this do the thing that we set out to do? And if it doesn't, what do we want to do to fix that? And if it does, are we still happy with that as a goal? The third thing is, I think, a basic technical understanding of every discipline, which I know sounds like a lot, but it is extremely important, and it's maybe less work than you think. It's probably involves like watching a few hours of videos on YouTube of people within disciplines talking about the sort of baseline things that go into what their job entails. So watching tutorials on how level designers work, how they approach conceiving a level, laying a level out, iterating on a level. For audio engineers, thinking about how they work with sound, with files, what ambient sounds are, sounds that they use in gameplay, what ducking is, like really sort of key things that help inform this is what the people in this discipline are doing all the time. Art, which is concept art, it's also environment art, character art. There's lots of things that go into it, but understanding the basics of what they're doing, whether it's 2D or 3D. Animation, how rigs work, how skinning works, just kind of how animations work and how blending works. Things like procedural or secondary animation. Again, you don't have to have a comprehensive knowledge, but enough to talk to people. Because if you can't really have a conversation with, for example, a programmer, which is another discipline that is worth understanding, very key to making games. If you can't understand the sort of basics of how people work, it's hard to get into the specifics. And if you have the basics, you can have a conversation about, again, what you're trying to accomplish, why maybe if you request something, you understand this is easy versus difficult. Having that basic technical understanding is very important. And these days, practically speaking, most game developers are working in Unreal or Unity. So having a basic understanding of those engines, again, not super in depth, but if you don't know anything about them, it's going to be pretty hard to just work with people. So learn the basics of both of those engines. And then the last thing I would say is personal pacing. I think this is, again, a thing that it's hard to understand when you get into the industry, especially if you're very excited, and especially if you're working on a small team with a bunch of other inexperienced developers, is games take a long time to make. Even a fast game takes a long time to make for most people. And you have to pace yourself in how you work. I used to do, not so much anymore, I used to do a lot of endurance cycling. And you learn you can't go all out. If you're going to ride for 6 hours, if you're going to do a century, let's say, you can't go all out right away. As a normal person, you can't do that. So you have to learn how to pace yourself over time. It's very tempting to dive in and work as hard as you can, as fast as you can, but you can get very exhausted and then you can actually burn out. There are a number of ways to become burned out, but anyway, it can be very unhealthy to work at an unsustainable pace for years. Now, I have some advice for writers, and I will say a caveat for this. It's interesting. Over my career, people have thought of me primarily as a system designer. Now, some people think of me primarily as a writer, maybe because of Pentiment, and which is understandable. But I don't really have a formal background educationally as a writer. I know a lot of writers who do, and they're better writers than I am. But I will give my perspective on how I felt like I grew as a writer over time. And these are things that I wish I were more attentive to earlier in my career. And I do think that experienced, trained writers get this more quickly than I did. They learned more quickly. So one thing is I will say is distinct character voices. To emphasize, games have, this is sort of an oversimplification. Games have a lot of text. Games have so much text and so much dialogue and so many characters. And because you have so many characters, and often the time you spend with characters is a little bit more than you might, for example, in like a TV show or a movie. A lot of supplemental characters have a lot more time with the player than they would with a film viewer, where a character might walk on and literally say one line and then never appear again. So having a wide range of distinct character voices and being able to develop those voices pretty quickly is important. If characters feel like they fall into sort of the same sort of pattern and range of voices over the course of a very long game, it's going to get boring. So you need that variety, and you as a writer need the ability to create that variety on your own within the characters that you write. It's very important that you be able to adapt both to the company's style. There are usually style guides, a house style, and that might be a certain tone or certain punctuation rules or grammatical contrivances that the team wants to use. Individual projects or IPs will also often have a style. This extends to things like slang. For example, if you made a cyberpunk game, there's a lot of cyberpunk slang, and understanding how it's used and incorporated and how it's not used is very important. But your style doesn't need to disappear, but it does need to adapt to the style of the team that you're working with and the IP. It's the thing that I think most people think of with game writing is that you're writing dialogue and maybe you're writing descriptive prose. This can vary based on the project. And that's true. That is usually the majority of the dialogue that you write. But there is a large volume, tens of thousands at least, of words in a lot of games that are just supplemental. They're in menus, they're in examinable text, they're in books that you can find in world, and those take a variety of different tones and styles. Sometimes you're writing in-game fiction, in-game instruction manuals. Sometimes it's not in-game. It's a developer. It's a tutorial basically. Things like that. There's just a lot of supplemental text that you wind up writing over time, and it can kind of fall into the back of your mind as a thing that you're going to get to later. Later will come, and then you're going to have to write all that stuff. And it's better to pace that stuff out over time. And back to pacing again, what I will say, if you are a game writer, the pacing of games is not like the pacing of films. It's not like the pacing of short stories or novels. It's its own thing. The player spends usually a great deal of time with the game. I mean, there are very short games, but even short games are much longer than a film. And some of them are hundreds of hours long. And so the player is sitting through a lot of conversation. And it's not that a person playing a video game is dumb or something, or they don't want to read, or they don't want to be in dialogue. But pacing is important. Like, you get fatigued, and you have to be attentive to how the player, the viewer, the reader is experiencing that, and where their attention is going to start to drift, or where things get too technical, too dense, things are too complicated within a short period of time. And I don't think I'm great at this. I think I've become better over time, but it is very important. Players can sit through hundreds of thousands, millions of lines of dialogue, but keeping their attention, part of that is the pacing of the conversation and the length of lines and all that sort of stuff. It's very important. So those are my opinions. Get used to writing supplemental text. As a game developer, what skills are important? And if you're a writer, what things I think are important in joining a team? I don't think I can offer necessarily any advice on how to get a job right now, especially because it's hard. But I do think these skills are important. Hopefully you find them useful. Thanks.